What you're about to see comes from a state wildlife biologist whose trail cameras recorded 6 weeks of something she was never supposed to find. She was assigned to survey 40 square miles of old-growth forest that hadn't been studied in over a decade. Within days, her cameras started being disabled in the middle of the night, carefully rotated on their mounts by something with hands. The footage shows a massive figure, over 7 feet tall, covered in dark fur, walking upright on 2 legs. The head isn't primate, it's canine, and in the clearest shot, it's staring directly into the lens, like it knows exactly what it's looking at. When she submitted her findings, the report was erased. Her notebooks were confiscated, her computer was wiped, and she was transferred 300 miles away before the week was out. But she made copies of everything, and this is her story. So before we get into it, make sure you subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. Thanks. She works for the state as a wildlife biologist. Has for about 12 years now. Her job involves monitoring animal populations in designated wilderness areas, tracking migration patterns, documenting predator-prey relationships, keeping tabs on endangered species. It's mostly field work. She spends weeks at a time in remote forest, setting up camera traps, collecting scat samples, cataloging tracks and signs. She knows animal behavior better than most people know their own families. She can look at a set of tracks in mud and tell you what made them, how fast it was moving, whether it was healthy or injured, how long ago it passed through. She's not the kind of person who gets spooked by shadows or mistakes a bear for something else. She's spent her entire career in the woods, alone most of the time, and she's seen just about everything these forests have to offer. Or so she thought. Last September, she was assigned to a new monitoring area. The state had expanded its wildlife survey program into a section of forest that hadn't been formally studied in over a decade. Budget cuts had kept crews out of the more remote areas for years, and now that funding had come through, they wanted baseline data on what was living out there. Her job was to set up a network of trail cameras across about 40 square miles of old-growth forest, dense canopy, steep terrain, the kind of wilderness that most recreational hikers never see because it's too far from any maintained trail. She'd be going in alone, which was standard for her. She preferred working solo. Said other people made too much noise, spooked the animals, slowed her down. She drove in as far as she could on an old logging road that hadn't seen maintenance in years. Potholes deep enough to swallow a tire, branches scraping both sides of her truck. The road ended at a wide spot in the trees where someone had once turned logging equipment around. From there, it was all on foot. She loaded up her pack with camera equipment, batteries, memory cards, mounting hardware, and started hiking into the survey area. The plan was to spend 5 days setting up cameras, then come back every 2 weeks to swap memory cards and check equipment. Standard procedure. She'd done this dozens of times in other areas without incident. The first thing she noticed was how quiet the forest was. Not normal quiet, not the hush you get in deep woods where the canopy blocks wind noise. This was something else. An absence. She'd been working in forests long enough to know what healthy woodland sounds like. Birds calling territory warnings, squirrels chattering, insects buzzing, woodpeckers hammering. Even in the quietest forests, there's always a baseline of animal noise. This place had none. She hiked for over an hour without hearing a single bird call. No squirrels, no chipmunks, nothing moving in the underbrush. Just her own footsteps and her own breathing. She noted it in her field journal, but didn't think much of it at the time. Some areas are quieter than others. Sometimes the timing is just off. She spent the first day scouting camera locations. Her method was systematic. She'd identify game trails, water sources, natural funnels where terrain forces animals through narrow areas. Then she'd mount cameras at the right height and angle to capture whatever passed through. She was good at reading the landscape, understanding where animals would naturally travel. By late afternoon, she'd identified 12 solid camera positions and had mounted the first 6. Each camera was strapped to a tree about 3 feet off the ground, aimed across a trail or water crossing, set to trigger on motion with both photo and video capability. High-quality units with infrared flash for nighttime captures. Professional equipment it could run for weeks on a set of batteries. It was while mounting the 4th camera that she found the first thing that didn't make sense. She was securing the unit to a large oak near a creek crossing when she noticed marks on the tree about 8 feet up. At first, she thought they were bear marks. Black bears will claw at trees to mark territory, usually leaving ragged vertical scratches in the bark. But these weren't like that. They were too high for a standing bear, too evenly spaced, too deliberate. 5 parallel grooves gouged deep into the hardwood, repeated in sets of 4 at different heights going up the trunk. The lowest set was at about 7 feet, the highest at nearly 10. Whatever made them was tall and could reach well above its own head. She photographed the marks, measured them, noted the spacing. The grooves were about 3/4 of an inch apart, consistent with something that had 5 fingers or claws on one hand. Not bear claws, which are wider and more curved. These were straighter, more like thick nails dragged through wood with tremendous force. She found similar marks on 2 more trees nearby. Same pattern, same spacing, same impossible height. She spent 20 minutes examining them, running through every animal she knew that could leave marks like that. Nothing fit. Bears don't reach that high. Mountain lions don't claw trees in that pattern. No bird of prey or climbing animal she could think of would leave marks like those. She wrote it all down in her journal, took more photos, and moved on. Interesting anomaly. Worth investigating further. That's how she thought about it at the time. Just an interesting anomaly. She finished setting up the remaining cameras over the next 2 days, working from dawn to dusk, covering miles of rough terrain each day. On the second afternoon, while mounting a camera near a small waterfall, she heard something that made her stop what she was doing and just listen. A sound from deeper in the forest, maybe a 1/4 mile away. It was low and sustained, almost like a horn being blown very slowly, rising in pitch and then fading out. It lasted maybe 5 seconds, then silence. She waited for 10 minutes, standing perfectly still with her hands frozen on the camera mount, but the sound didn't repeat. She told herself it was probably an elk bugling late in the season, though she knew it didn't sound anything like an elk. Elk bugles are high and wavering. This was deep, controlled, purposeful, like a signal. That night, she camped at the edge of the survey area, planning to finish up and hike out the next morning. She'd camped alone in the wilderness hundreds of times, and it had never bothered her. This time was different. She lay in her tent listening to nothing, not just quiet, but a total void of sound. No wind, no water noise, even though she was camped near a stream, no nighttime animal sounds whatsoever. It was like the forest had been emptied of everything except her. She slept badly, kept waking up with the feeling that something was close. Something was right outside the tent wall. Each time she turned on her headlamp and looked out through the mesh, she saw nothing, just dark trees and frost on the ground. But the feeling persisted, that crawling sensation on the back of your neck that means you're being observed. She packed up before first light and finished her work fast, wanting to be back at her truck before dark. She hiked back out to her truck and drove the 3 hours home on winding forest roads. The whole time she kept thinking about those claw marks and that sound in the forest. Something about all of it bothered her in a way she couldn't quite articulate. It wasn't fear, not yet. It was more like a puzzle piece that didn't fit any picture she knew. She'd been studying wildlife for 12 years, and she'd never seen anything like those marks, never heard a vocalization she couldn't at least tentatively identify. That should have been exciting, a possible new discovery. Instead, it left her with an uneasy feeling she couldn't shake. 2 weeks later, she went back for the first card swap. Hiked in with a fresh set of memory cards and batteries, planning to collect whatever the cameras had captured and replace the power supplies. The hike-in felt different this time. The silence was still there, maybe even deeper than before. And there was a smell. Faint but distinct, like wet dog mixed with something musky and sour. She caught it in patches, stronger in some areas than others. Always near the creek bottoms and low areas where moisture collected. She'd smelled plenty of animals in the wild. Bear musk, elk rut, fox dens. This wasn't any of those. It was something organic and mammalian, but nothing she could place. The cameras were all where she'd left them, but 3 of them had been moved. Not knocked down by animals or shifted by wind. Physically turned on their mounts. The straps were still tight around the trees, but the camera housings had been rotated, so they pointed at the ground or up at the canopy instead of across the game trails. She'd used professional mounting brackets that required opposable thumbs and deliberate force to adjust. A bear pawing at a camera would knock it off the tree entirely. These had been carefully, purposefully redirected. Someone or something had figured out what the cameras were for and turned them away from where they were watching. She checked those 3 cameras first. The memory cards showed normal wildlife footage up to a point. Deer, a coyote, a raccoon family. Then there were a few frames of something large and dark, moving at the edge of the frame. Too fast and too close to the lens to make out clearly. Just a blur of dark fur and movement. Then the camera angle shifts abruptly in the next photo, suddenly pointing at dirt and leaves. Whatever moved past the camera then turned it. The timestamps showed this happened at night, between 2 and 4 in the morning, across all 3 cameras. Same night. Something had visited all 3 cameras in a 2-hour window and disabled them. The other 9 cameras had been left alone. She collected all 12 cards and replaced them, and re-aimed the 3 that had been moved. On her hike out, she took a different route, looping wider through the survey area to check for other signs. That's when she found the tracks. In a muddy section near a seasonal stream, pressed deep into the soft ground, she found footprints that stopped her cold. They were huge. Easily 14 inches long, maybe 6 inches wide at the ball of the foot. 5 distinct toe impressions with what looked like claw marks extending forward from each toe. The shape was roughly humanoid, but the proportions were wrong. Too wide for a human foot, toes too long, heel too narrow. The depth of the impression told her whatever made it was extremely heavy, probably over 400 pounds based on her experience estimating animal weight from track depth. She knelt beside those tracks for a long time, just looking. In her 12 years of fieldwork, she had never found a print she couldn't identify to at least the family level. She could tell you the difference between a gray wolf and a red wolf track from 20 feet away. Could distinguish black bear from grizzly on sight. These tracks didn't belong to anything in any identification guide she'd ever studied. The mud had captured incredible detail. She could see individual skin ridges on the toe pads, the curved indentations where claws had dug in as the foot pushed off, even a slight drag mark behind the heel, where whatever it was had shifted its weight during the stride. The print was fresh enough that water hadn't fully seeped into the depressions. Made within the last few hours, maybe less. But what really got her attention was the stride. The prints were spaced about 4.5 feet apart, in a straight line, 1 foot directly in front of the other. That's a bipedal gait, something walking on 2 legs. A bear on its hind legs has a shuffling, short-strided walk and rarely covers more than a few yards before dropping back to all 4s. These tracks went on for over 60 feet in a straight line without any sign of the animal dropping to 4 legs. Whatever made them was walking upright as its normal mode of travel. She measured everything, photographed everything, made detailed sketches in her journal. Her hands weren't shaking. Not yet. She was still in scientist mode, documenting an unknown. She drove home that night, with the memory cards on the passenger seat and didn't sleep well. Kept getting up to look at the photos on her laptop, zooming in on those blurry frames, trying to pull detail out of images that just didn't have enough resolution. The shape was big, dark-furred, and upright. That was all she could say for certain. She told herself it was probably a bear. Had to be a bear. Bears stand up sometimes, and in a fast-moving, low-light photo, a bear could look like almost anything. But the tracks weren't bear tracks. She knew that in her bones. She'd been looking at bear tracks her entire career, and those prints were something else entirely. And the cameras being turned, that was the part she kept coming back to. She'd seen bears interact with trail cameras before. They'd knock them off trees, chew on them, step on them. They didn't carefully rotate the housing on a professional mounting bracket. That took hands. That took understanding of what the device was doing, and a deliberate intention to stop it from doing it. The next 2 weeks were hard. She went about her regular work, filed her reports, attended meetings. She didn't mention the turned cameras or the tracks to anyone yet. Wanted to get more data first. Didn't want to be the person crying wolf over what might turn out to have a perfectly normal explanation. But she started doing research on her own time. Quietly, carefully, looking into reports of large bipedal animals in forested regions. She found more than she expected. Reports going back decades from that general area and others like it. Hunters who'd seen something they couldn't explain. Campers who'd heard sounds that didn't match any known animal. Other biologists who'd found tracks they couldn't identify, but had kept quiet about it for fear of professional ridicule. When she went back for the second card swap, she added 4 more cameras to the network. These she placed higher in the trees, about 8 feet up, angled downward. Her thinking was that whatever had turned the other cameras had reached them at chest height. By mounting new ones higher up, she might catch whatever it was before it could disable them. She also placed 2 cameras watching other cameras, aimed so that if something approached one unit, the other would capture it from a different angle. It was a strategy she'd used before when trying to document shy predators. Create overlapping fields of view so the animal can't avoid all of them at once. She also brought something new this time. A set of audio recorders, small weatherproof units that could run continuously for 2 weeks, recording all sound in the area. If whatever was out there was making noise, she wanted to capture it. She placed the recorders near water sources and along the game trails, tucked into hollows in trees where they'd be hard to spot. The whole setup took an extra day, but when she hiked out, she felt like she had the area properly covered. 16 cameras and 6 audio recorders spread across 40 square miles. Whatever was living out there, she was going to document it. 2 weeks later, she went back, and that's when everything changed. 4 of the original cameras had been turned again. Same method, careful rotation on the mounts. But the higher cameras she'd added were untouched. And 2 of them had captured footage that made her sit down on a log and stare at the preview screen for a long time without moving. The first camera, mounted at 8 feet on a pine overlooking a game trail, had triggered at 3:17 in the morning. The infrared photos showed something walking down the trail toward the camera. The first frame caught it at about 40 feet away, mostly obscured by trees, but clearly visible enough to see that it was upright, on 2 legs, moving with a fluid stride that covered ground quickly. The second frame, triggered about 3 seconds later, showed it much closer, maybe 20 feet from the camera. The infrared illumination lit it up clearly against the dark forest background. It was not a bear. It was not a person. It was something she had no classification for. The thing stood well over 7 feet tall, broad across the shoulders, covered in dark fur that looked coarse and thick. The build was massive, heavy through the chest and arms, with legs that were proportionally shorter than a human's, but clearly built for bipedal movement. The arms were long, hanging past where the hips would be, and the hands were large with visible fingers. But the head was what made her breath catch. It wasn't a primate's head. The skull was elongated, with a pronounced snout, pointed ears set high on the head, and eyes that caught the infrared light and reflected it back as bright discs. The overall shape of the head looked canine, like a wolf's head on a massive, upright, humanoid body. The third frame showed it even closer, maybe 15 feet from the camera, and in this image, it was looking directly at the lens. Directly at her, she felt, even though she was looking at a photo taken 2 weeks earlier. The eyes were intelligent, not the blank stare of a startled deer caught in a trail camera flash. This thing was looking at the camera with what she could only describe as awareness. It knew the camera was there. It was evaluating it. The expression on its face, and she used that word deliberately because it had expressions, showed something like curiosity mixed with irritation. Like someone who keeps finding surveillance cameras in their house and is getting tired of it. The fourth and fifth frames showed it reaching up toward the camera. In the fourth frame, its arm is extended, hand open, fingers spread. In the fifth frame, the image blurs as the camera is being pushed. The sixth frame shows sky and branches. The camera had been shoved upward on its mount, aimed at the canopy. But those 5 clear frames before it reached the camera were the best documentation she'd ever seen of any animal in her career. And this was no animal she'd ever heard of. The second camera that hit gold was one of the ones she'd set up to watch another camera. It was angled to cover the approach to a unit mounted on a tree near a creek crossing. The footage it captured showed not one but 2 of the creatures. They came from downstream, walking side by side along the creek bank at 2:48 in the morning. One was clearly larger than the other, maybe 8 feet tall to the smaller one 7. They moved quietly, but not silently, their feet making soft sounds in the creek gravel. The way they moved together was striking. The larger one slightly ahead, the smaller one matching its pace exactly, their strides synchronized in a way that spoke of long familiarity. They walked like 2 people who had traveled together for years, who knew each other's rhythm without thinking about it. They walked directly to the camera she'd mounted by the creek, and the larger one reached up and turned it while the smaller one stood nearby, watching. Not watching the larger one work, watching the forest around them, standing guard, scanning the tree line, head moving slowly from side to side, ears visibly rotating on top of its head. The whole thing took about 15 seconds. Then they walked back the way they'd come and disappeared into the darkness downstream. She watched that clip maybe 50 times. Each time she noticed something new. The way the larger one knew exactly how the camera mount worked, didn't fumble with it, just reached up and rotated it in one smooth motion. The way the smaller one positioned itself at an angle that gave it the widest field of view of the surrounding area. The way they never vocalized during the entire sequence, operating in complete silence, like they'd done this before and didn't need to communicate about it. She had them working together, coordinating, one acting as lookout while the other disabled the camera. That wasn't just intelligence. That was teamwork, planning, division of labor. These creatures understood what the cameras were, understood they were being watched, and had developed a systematic approach to dealing with the surveillance. The implications were staggering. The audio recorders added another dimension. 5 of the 6 had captured something. Normal forest sounds during the day, silence or near silence at night, but in the early morning hours, between roughly 2 and 5 a.m., the recorders picked up sounds she'd never heard before. Low vocalizations, deep and resonant, almost below the range of human hearing. Some were short barking sounds, others were longer, drawn-out calls that rose and fell in pitch. On 2 of the recorders, you could hear what sounded like 2 different voices calling back and forth, one deeper than the other, in a pattern that sounded disturbingly like conversation. Not words, not language as she understood it, but structured communication. Call and response, varying in tone and duration, with pauses that suggested listening and replying. There were also sounds of movement. Heavy footsteps, branches breaking, the splash of something large crossing water. and on one recorder, positioned near the creek, a sound that made the hair on her arms stand up when she listened to it on headphones. Something breathing, very close to the recorder, slow and deep. Then a sniffing sound, like a large animal testing the air. Then a low growl, barely audible, more felt than heard. Then the breathing moved away, and the forest went silent again. Whatever had found the recorder had investigated it, decided it wasn't a threat or wasn't interesting, and moved on. She now had clear photographic evidence, coordinated behavior between multiple individuals, audio recordings of unknown vocalizations, and weeks of data showing consistent nocturnal activity in the survey area. By any objective measure, she documented something significant, something new, something that would rewrite what people thought they knew about what lives in these forests. She spent a week organizing her data, labeling everything, creating a presentation with her best images and audio clips. Then she brought it to her supervisor. That meeting lasted about 20 minutes, and it did not go the way she expected. Her supervisor looked at the photos, listened to a few seconds of audio, and told her she probably had a bear with mange. Said the upright posture was just a bear standing on its hind legs. The claw marks were from a bear marking territory. The sounds were normal bear vocalizations recorded at a distance that distorted them. When she pointed out the bipedal tracks, the stride length, the coordinated camera disabling, he told her she was reading too much into normal animal behavior. Said bears are smarter than people give them credit for, and that a curious bear could easily turn a trail camera. When she pushed back, showed him the clearest photo with the canine head and the intelligent eyes, he got uncomfortable. Shifted in his chair, wouldn't make eye contact. Told her to focus on the species she was actually assigned to monitor and to stop wasting department resources on what he called inconclusive anomalies. She left that meeting feeling like she'd been punched. Not angry, not at first, just stunned. She'd walked in with the most extraordinary wildlife documentation of her career, and walked out being told to pretend it didn't exist. But she wasn't ready to give up. She reached out to a few colleagues she trusted, other field biologists who'd worked remote areas, showed them the photos, played them the audio. Their reactions were mixed. A couple were genuinely intrigued, asked thoughtful questions, wanted to see more data. But most of them had the same uncomfortable reaction her supervisor had. They'd look at the clearest photos, the ones that obviously showed something that wasn't a bear, and you could see them mentally backing away from what they were seeing. Nobody wanted to be associated with this kind of evidence. Nobody wanted to be the person who said they'd found something impossible. One colleague was honest enough to tell her why. Said that in their field, your reputation is everything. Grant funding, tenure, job security, it all depends on being taken seriously by other professionals. And nothing kills a wildlife biologist's credibility faster than claiming to have found an unknown species, especially one that sounds like it belongs in a campfire story. He told her that even if her evidence was real, even if she documented something genuinely new, coming forward with it would end her career. She'd be labeled as the person who believes in monsters. Nobody would fund her research. Nobody would hire her. Nobody would cite her work. The professional consequences would be permanent, regardless of how good her data was. She heard him. She understood the risk. But she had 16 cameras and 6 audio recorders generating data every 2 weeks, and each collection cycle was producing more evidence. On her third card swap, she got footage of 3 of the creatures together, moving through a clearing in what looked like a patrol pattern. One in front, one behind, one off to the side. They covered the open ground quickly and disappeared into the tree line on the far side. The formation was deliberate, organized. These things weren't randomly wandering. They were moving through their territory with purpose and coordination. The 4th collection was the most disturbing. One of her cameras, mounted near a ridge overlooking a valley, captured something she still has trouble talking about. The footage showed one of the creatures standing on the ridge at dusk, before full darkness, in enough ambient light that the image was clearer than anything the infrared had produced. It was standing completely still, looking down into the valley. The posture was contemplative, if that word can be applied to something like this. It stood there for almost 10 minutes, based on the time-stamped gaps between triggered photos. Just standing, looking, like a person surveying a landscape they know well. There was something deeply unsettling about the stillness, the patience, the obvious awareness. But what the camera captured next was worse. The creature turned and looked back over its shoulder, directly at the camera, not casually, not by accident. It turned and stared at the lens with an expression that communicated something very clearly. It knew the camera was there. It had always known. And it had chosen, until that moment, not to do anything about it. The look in its eyes was calm, measured, not aggressive, almost resigned. Like it was tired of being watched, but had decided to tolerate it for now. Then it turned back to the valley and walked away, disappearing down the slope with long, easy strides. It never disabled that camera. It left it running. She wasn't sure if that was more or less frightening than if it had smashed the thing. After the fourth collection, she had hundreds of photos, hours of audio, and video clips, totaling almost 40 minutes. She documented at least 4 distinct individuals based on size differences and markings in the fur. The creatures were exclusively nocturnal in their above-ground activity, though she suspected they had daytime shelters somewhere in the area, possibly caves or deep ravines where the terrain was too rough for her to access. They were intelligent, coordinated, aware of her monitoring equipment, and seemed to be deliberately managing their exposure to her cameras. They disabled some cameras, but left others running, almost as if they were controlling how much she could see, feeding her information in measured doses. She made one more attempt to get official attention. She compiled her best evidence into a detailed report, proper formatting, data tables, statistical analysis of movement patterns, everything by the book. She submitted it through official channels as a request for expanded survey resources, citing the presence of an unidentified large mammal species in the study area. She was careful with her language, didn't speculate about what the creatures were, just presented the physical evidence and requested additional funding and personnel to investigate further. The response came back in 3 days, which was suspiciously fast for bureaucratic channels that usually took weeks. Her request was denied. The survey area was being reassigned to another biologist. Her camera equipment was to be retrieved immediately, and she was being transferred to a different region, effective the following Monday. No discussion, no appeal process, no opportunity to present her findings to anyone higher up the chain. Just a flat reassignment that moved her away from the area and handed her work to someone else. She went back one final time to collect her cameras. The hike-in felt different, knowing it was the last time. She moved through the silent forest with a heaviness that had nothing to do with the weight of her pack. She'd spent 6 weeks documenting something remarkable, something that could change how people understand these forests, and it was being swept away like it never happened. She collected the cameras methodically, checking each one, swapping out the last set of memory cards. Most of the cameras were where she'd left them, but 2 were missing entirely. Not fallen, not knocked down. Gone. Straps still buckled around the trees, mounting brackets still in place, but the camera units had been removed. Carefully, deliberately removed by hands that understood how the buckles worked. On her way out, hiking the last mile back to the logging road, she had her only direct encounter. She'd been walking with her head down, tired and frustrated, not paying as much attention to her surroundings as she should have been. A sound made her stop, not a footstep, not a branch breaking. A sound she'd heard dozens of times on her audio recordings, but never in person. A low, resonant vocalization, deep enough to feel in her chest, coming from the tree line maybe 50 yards to her right. She stood absolutely still. Her training kicked in before her fear did. Don't run. Don't make sudden movements. Make yourself visible and wait. She waited. The forest was dead silent, except for her own heartbeat, which she was pretty sure was audible from 50 yards away. Then she saw it, standing between two large pines, partially obscured by brush and shadow, but unmistakable. Massive, dark, upright. Its head was above a branch, she estimated at 7.5 feet. It was watching her with those intelligent eyes she'd seen in hundreds of trail camera photos, but never in person. In person, the eyes were worse. Not because they were threatening, but because they were understanding. The creature was looking at her the way a person looks at another person, with recognition, with evaluation, with something that might have been respect or might have been warning. They stood there looking at each other for what felt like minutes, but was probably 30 seconds. She didn't reach for her phone, didn't try to take a photo. Something about the moment felt like it would break if she moved. Then the creature made another sound, softer this time, almost like a low hum. And it stepped back. One step, then another, melting into the shadows between the trees until it was gone. The forest stayed silent for another full minute. Then, gradually, she heard a bird call. Then another. Then the normal sounds of the woods returning, like someone had turned up the volume on a radio that had been muted. She hiked out fast after that. Didn't run, but moved with purpose. Got to her truck, loaded her gear, and drove the 3 hours home without stopping. Her hands were steady on the wheel. She wasn't panicking. She was thinking about what she'd seen and what it meant. Thinking about the fact that she'd spent 6 weeks setting up cameras and collecting data, but the creature she just looked in the eye had been aware of her presence the entire time. Every time she'd hiked into that forest, every time she'd mounted a camera or collected a memory card, they knew she was there. They'd watched her the way she'd been trying to watch them. The only difference was they were better at it. When she got home, she made copies of everything. Every memory card, every audio recording, every photo. Put copies on external hard drives, uploaded encrypted versions to cloud storage, mailed a physical copy to a family member with instructions not to open it unless something happened to her. She wasn't being paranoid. She was being careful. Because she'd already seen how fast the official channels could move when they wanted to make something disappear, and she wasn't going to let 6 weeks of work vanish into a filing cabinet somewhere. Good thing she did? When she showed up at her office the following Monday, everything was gone. Her field notebooks had been collected from her desk. Her computer had been rummaged, all files wiped. The official report she'd submitted was nowhere in the system, no record that it had ever been filed. Her new assignment was waiting on her desk, a routine deer population survey in an area 300 miles from the forest where she'd been working. The message was clear. Move on. Forget what you saw. Don't talk about it. She asked around quietly, trying to find out who had ordered the data purge. Nobody knew anything. Or nobody was willing to say they knew anything, which amounts to the same thing. Her supervisor wouldn't meet with her, said he was too busy with budget reviews. The IT department said the reimaging was part of a routine system upgrade, though nobody else in the office had their machines wiped. The field notebooks, she was told, had been archived per standard records management policy. When she asked where the archive was located and how she could access it, she was given a form to fill out that required 3 levels of supervisory approval. She filled it out. It was never processed. She followed up twice, and both times was told the request was pending review. After the second follow-up, she got a call from someone in the administrative office she'd never spoken to before, telling her that pursuing records requests outside her current assignment scope was not a productive use of department time. The voice was pleasant, but the message was unmistakable. She didn't forget. She couldn't. She'd looked that thing in the eyes, and it had looked back at her, and in that moment she knew with absolute certainty that it was aware of itself and aware of her, and that it had made a conscious choice to let her see it. That's not something you forget. That's not something you file away and move on from. She continued working her new assignment, doing her job, keeping her head down. But at home, on her own time, she went through the data, cataloged everything, organized it, backed it up again and again. She tried one more time to get the evidence out there. Reached out to a few wildlife organizations, ones she thought might be more open-minded than the state bureaucracy. Sent carefully worded inquiries, shared a few of the clearest photos. Most never responded. 2 wrote back with polite versions of the same message. Interesting but inconclusive. Could be a bear. Could be photo artifacts. Would need much more evidence before they could commit resources to investigating. One person, someone she'd known professionally for years, called her directly and told her to stop. Not unkindly, but firmly. Said he'd heard of other people in similar positions, people who'd found things the system didn't want found, and that the ones who kept pushing all ended up in the same place. Unemployed, discredited, and no closer to getting anyone to listen? She stopped pushing after that. Not because she gave up, but because she realized that the official channels were never going to work. The system was designed to prevent exactly this kind of discovery from reaching the public. Not through some grand conspiracy, not through shadowy government agents, but through something much more mundane. Professional pressure. Career consequences. The simple, crushing weight of institutional inertia that resists anything that doesn't fit the accepted framework. You don't need a cover-up when the system itself is built to reject inconvenient evidence. People will silence themselves to protect their jobs and their reputations. It's more effective than any conspiracy because it's self-enforcing. The person she'd been reassigned to replace in the survey area did exactly what she expected. Filed reports showing normal wildlife populations, no anomalies, no unusual activity. Either he didn't find anything because the creatures had learned to avoid the new observer, or he did find something and made the same calculation everyone else had made. Career versus truth. Most people choose career. She doesn't blame them. She might have made the same choice if she hadn't looked into those eyes. She still has the data. All of it. The clear photos of the creatures, the audio recordings of their vocalizations, the footage of them working together to disable cameras, the documentation of tracks and claw marks. She keeps it backed up in multiple locations. Encrypted, secure. She doesn't show it to people anymore. Not unless she trusts them completely. She showed it to me because we've known each other for a long time, and she needed someone to understand what she'd been through. Needed someone to look at the evidence and not immediately start explaining it away. I saw the photos. I listened to the audio. I don't know what lives in that forest, but I know it's not a bear, and it's not a person, and it's not anything that shows up in any field guide I've ever seen. The photos are clear enough that there's no ambiguity. Large, bipedal, canine-headed, covered in dark fur, moving through the forest at night with purpose and intelligence. The audio recordings are haunting. Those low vocalizations, the call and response patterns, the deep breathing near the recorder. It sounds like something that shouldn't exist, but obviously does, because the cameras don't lie, and the microphones don't lie, and the footprints in the mud don't lie. What bothers me most is the intelligence. Not just that the creatures are smart enough to find and disable trail cameras. That alone is remarkable. But the pattern of behavior she documented suggests something much more sophisticated. They identified the cameras within days of installation. They developed a strategy for dealing with them. They adapted when she changed her approach, when she mounted cameras higher or at different angles. They coordinated their movements, communicated with each other, established what appeared to be regular patrol routes through their territory. And they made a choice about her. They could have scared her off at any time. A few aggressive encounters, some close approaches, damaged equipment. That's how most territorial animals deal with intruders. Instead, they seemed to observe her the same way she was observing them. Watching, documenting in their own way, figuring out what she was and what she wanted. That final encounter, the one where they looked at each other across 50 yards of forest, was the most telling. The creature chose to show itself. It could have stayed hidden, could have let her walk out without ever knowing it was there. But it stepped into view, made a sound to get her attention, and stood there while she looked at it. Then it made that softer sound, the one that felt almost like a farewell, and walked away. She interprets that encounter as a message. You've seen what you needed to see. Now it's time to go, and we're going to let you. The letting her go part is what keeps me awake at night, because it implies a decision-making process. It implies that these creatures considered what to do about a human who was actively documenting their existence, and decided that the appropriate response was to allow her to leave with her evidence. Maybe they understood that she couldn't do anything with it. Maybe they'd seen this before, other humans stumbling onto their territory, gathering evidence, being shut down by their own institutions. Maybe they knew from experience that humans are very good at ignoring things they don't want to believe. Or maybe they just didn't see her as a threat. She was one person with cameras, not a hunting party with guns. She wasn't trying to hurt them or capture them. She was just trying to see them. And maybe, on some level, they respected that. The look in the creature's eyes when it showed itself to her, she describes it as sad. Not threatening, not aggressive. Sad, like it was tired of hiding, tired of being invisible, tired of living alongside a species that refuses to acknowledge it exists. That's probably me reading too much into a 30-second visual encounter. But she felt it too. Said the sadness was the thing she remembers most clearly. She's still working as a wildlife biologist, still doing fieldwork, still spending time in remote forests. But she doesn't go back to that area. Her transfer made sure of that, and she's not inclined to push the boundary. Whatever agreement was silently made between her and the creatures in those woods, she intends to honor it. She saw them. They saw her. And now they both go back to their lives, existing in the same world, in the same forests, separated by the thinnest possible margin of visibility. She did go back once, about 4 months after her transfer. Not into the survey area itself, but to the old logging road where she used to park her truck. Just sat there for a while, looking at the tree line where the forest started and the road ended. Didn't hike in, didn't bring cameras. Just sat in her truck with the windows down, listening. The forest was quiet. That same heavy silence she remembered from her first visit. But after about 20 minutes, she heard it. A single vocalization from deep in the trees. That low, resonant call she'd recorded dozens of times on her audio equipment. One call, then silence. She chose to hear it as a greeting. Maybe it was a warning. Maybe it was nothing. But she sat there for another few minutes, said something quiet that she wouldn't tell me, and drove home. I'm telling you this because someone should know. Not the details that could identify her, or the exact location of the survey area, or anything that could put her or the creatures at risk. Just the fact that it happened. That a trained professional with 12 years of field experience spent 6 weeks documenting something extraordinary in a forest that people hike through every year, and that the evidence she collected was systematically ignored and suppressed by the same institutions that are supposed to study and protect wildlife. The system failed. Not because of conspiracy or malice, but because the system isn't built to handle discoveries that fall outside its categories. The creatures are still out there, in that forest and probably in others like it, living their lives, raising their young if they have them, traveling their territories, communicating with their calls and responses, watching us the same way we occasionally try to watch them. They figured out how to coexist with a species that outnumbers them by millions, how to stay hidden in an age of satellites and drones and thermal imaging. The fact that they've managed that for this long suggests they're better at this than we are, better at seeing without being seen, better at moving through the world without leaving traces that the official record is willing to acknowledge. They've survived by being invisible, by existing in the gaps between what we expect to find and what we're willing to accept. And they're very, very good at it. She told me once that the thing she can't get over isn't that they exist, it's that they're aware. Not just alive, not just intelligent in the way a crow or a dolphin is intelligent. Aware in a way that implies inner experience, self-knowledge, understanding of their place in the world. When that creature looked at her from between the pines, it knew what it was doing. It chose to be seen. It chose to let her see it. And it chose to walk away, knowing that she would carry the memory of that encounter for the rest of her life. That kind of intentionality isn't something we usually attribute to anything other than humans. But she saw it, clear as day, 50 yards away, looking right at her. Whatever they are, wherever they came from, they've been in those forests longer than our trail systems and our survey programs and our wildlife management frameworks. They were there before the logging roads and the camera traps and the biologists who come and go every few years with their equipment and their data sheets. They'll probably be there long after all of that is gone, and they'll keep doing what they've always done, moving through the dark, calling to each other across the valleys, watching us from the tree lines while we pretend they don't exist. Because pretending is easier than knowing, and knowing, once you really know, changes everything. She knows. I know now too. And now you know. Make of it what you will. But if you ever find yourself hiking through old-growth forest in a remote area, miles from any maintained trail, and the birds suddenly go quiet, and the air carries a smell you can't identify, and you feel like you're being watched by something that understands exactly what you are, trust that feeling. You're not imagining it. You're not alone out there. You never were.